Thank you, Paula. Television lights are a little brighter than other lights. I have a secret that I would like to share with you. I would say that I'm not really a historian. Rather, I am the very thing condemned by the great Greek philosopher Plato. I am a lover of sights and sounds, one of those that he condemned to the darkness of the cave, that is, to the life of this world, one not able to rise to the world of the forms. What interests me most of all about the past are not the wars and treaties and the great men on horseback, or even the theories of the great historians. What I try to do is to hold in my hands the pieces of the past, fragments of pottery, the face of an idol whose body has long since turned to dust, scraps of poetry. To hold these and to stay in their presence until I can begin to see and hear and love what living men and women once saw and heard and loved. And from these scraps and fragments, living men and women begin to emerge and move and live again. Only when this happens, only when I can see and hear and feel and smell these people of the past, can I begin to write a new book. In this way, I found that in the pages of the Confession of St. Patrick, written 15 centuries ago, there was concealed a living man, one of the most faithful, courageous, and generous human beings in all of Western history. Someone whose name should be spoken of in the same breath with Francis of Assisi and Joan of Arc. And in this same way, I tried for several years to live with the people of the Bible. I did this by traveling in the Middle East and spending time there, especially in the Sinai Desert, and living with its nomadic people. I did this by learning to read the Bible in Hebrew with Jewish scholars. But most especially, I lived with the people of the Bible simply by reading the Bible with attention, by forcing myself to consider each of its stories in their original context, however primitive, till I could finally see Abraham's tent staked out in the desert heat, and hear the sound of Miriam's timbrel as she danced her wild dance on the far shore after the drowning of Pharaoh's armies, and smell the fear of Israel's troops as they cowered before the bellowed challenge of Goliath, and feel the fingers of the Shulamite wet with myrrh as she opened the door bolt to her lover. You, my readers, if you will be my readers, must be the ultimate judges of whether or not I have resurrected the dead and brought them back to life within the covers of my book. But to understand the seminal contribution of the Jews to our civilization, it was also necessary to burrow into sources even more primeval, to begin to see with the eyes and hear with the ears of those who came before the Jews, those from whose world the Jews first emerged. So much of my time was spent among the Sumerians, a very strange people, and the Egyptians, and even further afield among prehistoric peoples. And I would say that if we delve deeply enough into the origins of every early society, we uncover similar patterns of thought and feeling. For one thing, all ancient worldviews are religious worldviews, since each intuits that the world of sights and sounds, the world that most of us live in most of the time, is less important, less real than the invisible world that lies beyond everyday perception. We might call this religious approach the form of all ancient worldviews. But even more striking than the form is the content of these worldviews, which are all essentially alike. Whether we examine the subtle systems of Greece and Rome, or the simpler animisms of prehistoric Africa and Europe, we can detect an essential sameness beneath the varied surfaces. For each view evokes a pattern, the pattern of a wheel, ever in motion. Summer, fall, winter, spring, summer, fall, winter, spring, over and over again. This is the eternal return. To everything there is a season, says the Bible in its least biblical book, and a time to every purpose under heaven. The life of human beings also follow the wheel. Birth, copulation, death, birth, copulation, death, over and over again. The ancient meaning of revolution refers to the wheel. It does not mean upheaval. It means that every period of upheaval will be followed by a period of peace, for peace is opposite upheaval on the wheel, as life is opposite death. And peace will come round again, as will upheaval, as will life, as will death, for there is nothing new under the sun. Death is indeed the central phenomenon of each system, the experience that all other experiences lead us to. All philosophy begins with death, proclaimed the neo-pagan Heidegger in our own century. Call no man lucky who is not dead, sings the chorus at the end of Oedipus, first performed 25 centuries ago. For only the dead are free from pain. To give you a third example, a man cannot be living forever, and we must be satisfied. This is the prehistoric philosophy of resignation with which John Millington Synge closes Riders to the Sea, his dramatization of the pagan life of the Aran Islanders. Well, what then is the good life in such a context? The good life is to come to resignation, to sit by the side of the river of life, to meditate on all that is past or passing or to come, and to realize that there is no escape from the wheel. This is what all the ancient sages did, whether Siddhartha or Heraclitus, Lao Tzu or Ecclesiastes. Black Elk, speaking of the ancient traditions of the most ancient Americans, said, everything an Indian does is in a circle, and that is because the power of the world always works in circles, and everything tries to be round. In the old days, when we were a strong and happy people, all our power came to us from the sacred hoop of the nation. Even the seasons form a great circle in their changing, and always come back again to where they were. The life of a man is a circle from childhood to childhood. And so it is in everything where power moves. That is to say, in everything where there is life. Now, if we took our whole philosophy of life from such sources as I have been quoting, the Western world would never have come to be. Luckily, however, there was this strange little desert tribe who decided not to do things in a circle. The Jews came out of the same religious matrix as all other ancient peoples, but somehow they got a new idea, the only really new idea in all of human history. The idea may seem a simple one, but it proves upon inspection to be so multifaceted that it cannot be easily expressed, except in story, which is exactly how the Jews themselves expressed it. Now the Lord said unto Abram, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless thee, and curse him that curseth thee, and in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed." So Abram departed, as the Lord had spoken unto him. This is brand new language, brimming with brand new notions and possibilities. With these words, the wheel is broken, and the very pattern of life, as previously encoded by all human societies and learned by heart by each human being, is erased. Abram has no guidelines. He must start afresh, as if no one had preceded him, as if he were the first man. For all previous human beings, wisdom and virtue had consisted in coming to terms with the great wheel. Prometheus, for instance, knew that the inexorable laws of heaven were built into the foundations of this world, and that to transgress these laws, to innovate, was to court certain tragedy. Abram is told that there are no rules, that he is not to sit by the river and contemplate his navel, but to set out for the unknown. Oedipus knew that surprise could only mean monstrosity. Abram learns, the first human being to do so, that surprise is to be welcomed and adventure to be sought. The perfectly symmetrical Greek temple was the very figure of Greek wisdom, an attempt to remove all danger of surprise, to mirror and ensure the predictability of the wheel. To the Greeks, a Gothic cathedral full of bizarre surprises would have seemed a house of horrors, a nightmare. In fact, such architecture could never have been conceived without the gifts of the Jews, without the historical intervention by which Jewish ideas entered the mainstream, transformed the worldview of the Western world, and gradually began to color the worldview of every human society. Unless there is a new mind, wrote William Carlos Williams, there cannot be a new line. The old will go on repeating itself with recurring deadliness. Without invention, nothing lies under the witch hazel bush. Abram's story is also the first story to incarnate the idea of individual destiny. Abram the singular is to have a singular story, completely unlike anybody else's. No expectable pattern, no summer, fall, winter, spring. He is unique, God has planned a miraculous destiny for him, utterly unlike anyone else's. For all previous societies, the past was to be studied for its patterns, so that one may predict the future. But Abram's future is unknowable. God is ordering him out into the unknown. Abram is not merely the sum of his past, of his genes, of all previous generations and ages. He is open to the new, to innovation, to what has never been before. He is to end a different person from the person he was when he began. So he needs a new name. Neither shall thy name any more be called Abram, but thy name shall be Abraham. For a father of many nations have I made thee, and I will make thee exceeding fruitful, and I will make nations of thee, and kings shall come out of thee. Now there is, of course, an organic continuity between Abram and Abraham, a continuity of identity. Abram is not replaced in a deus ex machina zapping. Rather, a new notion of time makes Abraham a new man. For the first time, time possesses a reality it never had before, when in all previous societies it was merely the expectable pattern of the wheel. Now time is real because the future is real and therefore unpredictable. The only reality the future has is that it has not happened yet. But that is a great deal more reality than it ever had before. These new realities do not enter Jewish consciousness overnight or without extraordinary travail. Even within the story of Abraham, the old worldview continually raises its world-weary laugh. And the Lord appeared unto Abraham in the plains of Mamre, and he sat there in the tent door in the heat of the day, the way you can still see Bedouin chieftains sitting under their tent flap, hoping that the funnel that they have opened up will create a little breeze, which it almost never does. And Abraham lifted his eyes and looked, and lo, 3 men stood by him. And when he saw them, he ran to meet them from the tent door and bowed himself toward the ground. Now, we know what Abraham doesn't yet know, that the 3 men are God accompanied by 2 angels. But Abraham thinks that they are desert chieftains or potentates that he has to impress. So he invites them for a bit of bread to show his hospitality, but he has a much more elaborate plan in mind than a bit of bread. And he goes running into the tent, somewhat hysterical, communicating this hysteria to his wife Sarah, and tells her that she must bake, 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 using only the best ingredients. And then, having gotten her all excited and upset, he runs out to the flocks and he chooses a calf to be slaughtered and prepared. And when all of that is done, he took butter and milk and the calf which he had dressed. This is long before halakha, for those of you who would not combine such ingredients in a single meal. And he set it before them. And he stood by them under the tree, like a waiter. And they did eat. And they said unto him, Where is Sarah thy wife? And he said, Behold, in the tent. I'm afraid he means where she belongs. And he said, that is to say, the big he, I will certainly return unto thee according to the time of life. And lo, Sarah thy wife shall have a son. And Sarah heard it in the tent door, which was behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old and well stricken in age, and it had ceased to be with Sarah after the manner of women. Therefore, Sarah laughed within herself, saying, now that I am grown old, shall pleasure come my way again? And my Lord is so old. The humor is still fresh in this incredibly ancient text, which in its oral form may be nearly 4,000 years old. This may be the only good 4,000-year-old joke left. And though we may find the shifting persona of the God from one Lord to three men to one he a bit confusing, we have no trouble appreciating what made Sarah laugh. It is the rightly cynical laugh of the ancient world, and it rings repeatedly through the Bible. Whether in the hysterical mirth of the worshippers of the golden calf, or the nothing can surprise me sneer of Ecclesiastes, the ancient Jews found it just as impossible as we do not to revert occasionally to the ways of the wheel. But the dominant chord struck in the Bible is not the laugh of Sarah, but the vocation of Abraham, whose unique openness to the future may be the richest aspect under which to appreciate the new Jewish worldview. For the first time in the long development of human consciousness, the future means hope rather than the same old thing. Adventure, surprise, and novelty no longer portend ill luck or catastrophe, as they had for all other civilizations. The ancient worldview that formed the bedrock of all other societies has been turned on its head. The individual is no longer a mere instance of the abstraction man. He is this unrepeatable man, Abraham, whose duty is not merely to conform his spirit to the already established laws of the cosmos. His duty is to seek his destiny, something new, something unique, something unprecedented. I found this wonderful quotation in the autobiography of Lincoln Kirstein, who, with George Balanchine, was the co-founder of the New York City Ballet. And Kirstein wrote, "My father taught me that the duty, despair, and destiny of Jews was to survive and proceed. Why or for what? He left for me to discover. Only with the Jews do the ideas of individuality and uniqueness, as we still mean them, become realities." Abraham is but the beginning of the story of the Jews, and many of the values that will come into full bloom in later centuries are only hinted at in the Abraham narrative. Abraham is an individual, all right, the individual of Genesis, and everyone else tends to be a supporting actor in his movie. But in subsequent stories, we see the new Jewish consciousness grow to embrace others. The story of the commandments, the 10 words given to Moses in the desert, begins to underscore the reality of others, that everyone is an individual, deserving to be treated as a human subject. In the story of King David, we at last enter the interior realm, the spirit and spirituality of individuals. David, who is for me the liveliest figure in the Hebrew Bible, is a great sinner and a great poet, a terrific literary combination. "Behold," sings David to God, "thou desirest truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part thou shalt make me to know wisdom. Make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Cast me not away from thy presence, and take not thy Holy Spirit from me. The exalted personalism of this relationship, this personal relationship between God and a human being, gradually interiorizes Jewish religion, so that when the prophets begin to scream that God wants justice and not sacrifice, not empty rituals but a righteous heart, a compassionate heart of flesh, not a cold heart of stone, at least some are ready to hear and understand. In the later books of the Bible, women are at last given justice. The Shulamite princess of the Song of Songs is surely one of the most astonishing women in all of world literature. Secure in herself, sexually frank, more than her lover's equal. One wonders what poor Sarah the baker would have made of some of her great lines. Love is as strong as death. Great seas cannot extinguish love. My beloved is mine, and I am his. My beloved is mine, and I am his. Mutual reciprocity. My own favorite among these later biblical materials is the book of Ruth. Almost certainly the work of a woman, the story of two women, the widowed Ruth and her mother-in-law Naomi. Ruth refuses to abandon the elder woman Naomi, but throws in her lot with this utterly resourceless person, which seems to portend only tragedy for Ruth, who says to Naomi, "Whither thou goest, I will go, and where thou lodgest, I will lodge. Thy people shall be my people, and thy God my God. Where thou diest, will I die. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if aught but death part thee and me." Thee and me. So like my beloved is mine, and I am his. Once again, mutual reciprocity, but this time with a completely different cast of characters, in a completely different story, and in completely different circumstances. By the end of the Hebrew Bible, the face-to-face relationship between God and individual human beings has at last encouraged reciprocal face-to-face relationships between human beings. The Jewish worldview contains not merely one new idea, but a cluster of concepts and fresh ways of feeling, with implications that will reverberate through all of subsequent history. The story that the Hebrew Bible has to tell is the story of the evolution of a sensibility, a gradual development, not an all-at-once revelation. But it is a development that spilled over into our world and generated almost our entire value system. There is a direct line of development, for instance, from the vocation of Abraham to the Declaration of Independence, whose ringing line, "All men are created equal," would be meaningless nonsense without the prior suppositions of the biblical worldview. Neither capitalism nor communism could have risen out of a society that worshipped the wheel. for both assume the possibility of progress, that tomorrow can be better than today. Even our idea of freedom owes its origins to the Jews, for it can be built only on the notion of radical openness to the future. Without future, there can be no freedom. And from our point of view, all the other ancient worldviews are hopeless. Only the view of this peculiar little Semitic tribe gives us faith and hope as we continue to mean those words. Most of our best words, in fact, new, adventure, surprise, unique, individual, person, vocation, time, history, future, freedom, progress, spirit, faith, hope, justice are the gifts of the Jews. Thank you. I would be happy to entertain some questions, which I hope will be entertaining. But before I get to that, I just wanted to make one brief comment, which is that I managed to talk to you for, I think, about 45 minutes without ever saying the word monotheism. And I don't want you to think that I don't know what it is. It is the value that underlies all the other values, and the better part of the gifts of the Jews is taken up in one way or another with a discussion of monotheism. But it is, I think, something that requires more than 45 minutes, and so I refer you to the gifts of the Jews. Yes, sir?
Many of your reviewers have mentioned that you're really much more talking about the gifts of the Hebrews or the Israelites than of the Jews, and I would think that, of course, you knew that and made a conscious decision to call the book The Gift of the Jews rather than The Gift of the Hebrews, and I'm wondering why.
Or The Gift of the Israelites,
yeah.
Which would have been, right. And I would ask you, well, for one reason, how many copies of The Gifts of the Israelites do you think I would have sold? I had a similar attack on the title of my first book, How the Irish Saved Civilization. People say, well, no, it should be How the Irish Saved Western Civilization. I said, all right, fine, but, you know, it's just one word too many. And there's a reason that's deeper than that. This is the... Abraham is not a Jew. He's not even part of a collectivity, right? He's one man with a little family, maybe an extended family at the most, right? In the book itself, I'm very careful to name this evolving people as they would have been named at the time, as, you know, the children of Israel, then as the Israelites, people around them, calling them the Hebrews. That's all in the book itself. But they do finally become the Jews, and it's only when they become the Jews that we can safely say that they had this collection of writings. And it is the collection of writings that we call the Hebrew Bible, in which we find the gifts of the Jews. We don't really know for sure what was going on in Abraham's mind, but we can read Genesis. So I think it is not merely a marketing ploy, but it is a deeply considered reason for choosing the word Jews rather than another word. This is, as I say at the outset of the book, neither an introduction to the Hebrew Bible nor an introduction to Judaism, but it is nonetheless an appreciation of ancient Judaism, not contemporary Judaism or the rabbinic Judaism of late antiquity or the Middle Ages, but it is nonetheless an appreciation of ancient Judaism and of the ancient Jews, who are the people who forged our value system. And there is a continuity between that people and the Jews of the present, which gives even more reason for using that word. And the last reason, I think, in both books, I tried to choose a word that almost went against the grain of, tried to choose a title that went against the grain of certain prejudices. How the Irish Saved Civilization people said, "You have to be kidding, that must be a blank book." All right, a little nasty, and you can imagine some of the comments that were made about the gifts of the Jews, so that it is almost a sort of in-your-face, here you are, you don't like it, read it and find out whether you can object to it. So there's a little emotion there under the surface. Let's try somebody in the back. Yes?
Okay.
Yeah.
In the process of researching the book, preparing yourself to write it and the writing of it, did you find yourself changed in any way? And if so, what? Or how?
I have read the Bible all my life, and I've always read it in a Christian context. I've read it with both Catholics and Protestants. Each of them has a different way. There's a different tone in Catholic Bible study and in Protestant Bible study. There's a different tone from in each one. But there are also ways in which they are the same. I would say that Christians, when they read the Bible, tend to want to get on to the next section. And I don't mean the New Testament, I just mean there's a certain impatience, with sort of, well, what does this mean? Who's our authority on this? Fine. Okay, that's what that means? Good. Now we go on to the next part, right? Authority is different within Protestantism and within Catholicism. They have different forms of authority that they look for, but they do in a funny way look for authorities. Spending a couple of years at JTS, Jewish Theological Seminary, I found you sit in a Bible study class with Jews, I think you could come back 2 years later and find them on the same sentence. Or maybe the same word. Or even the space between the words. And this comes from a number of things. I think partially the Hebrew Bible for Jews is their family history. It's their family document. They're extremely comfortable with it. It's like sitting on an old couch. You know, they love it, but there is a different familiarity, a sense of the familiar in reading it. And they're not going anywhere. You know, and more than that, I think this is the most interesting thing for me. There is an authority that comes out of this kind of discussion. I may completely disagree with you, and you may completely disagree with me, but we don't throw one another out of the room. And maybe sometimes. Though this whole process may be the ultimate form of the old saw, 2 Jews, 3 opinions, I think in the end there is a kind of shared or communal authority that comes out of reading in this way. And I would say that that was the most important change that this study made for me. There were others, of course, but I would think that that's the one that I would recall most signally and also most fondly. And I would also say that I think Christians could profit an enormous amount from reading the Bible with Jews. I would hope that places like Jewish Theological Seminary might see it as part of their mandate in coming years to encourage such a happening, which I think would bring us all closer together, but would be a particular gift of the Jews to non-Jews. Yes?
What about the idea and the concept and the beauty of the Shabbat, of the Sabbath.
What about the beauty of the concept of the Shabbat, of the Sabbath? I spend some time in the book on the Sabbath, which is definitely one of the gifts, one of the many gifts of the Jews. I couldn't include them all tonight. There was no way of doing it. And I suggest, that before the Jews, there was time was not divided into weeks, and certainly not into weekends. The weekend is one of the gifts of the Jews. Nobody had them before the Jews. And of course, you know that Moses has just brought the people out of Egypt. They are no longer slaves. And almost the first thing that they do is to create this weekly celebration of their freedom. That's really what it is. Only a free people has the right to leisure. And these people, so recently free, create a celebration of their freedom by setting aside a piece of each week for the leisure to think, to meditate, to pray, and to study. Talmud is being so important. The Jews are the first people to see education as a universal right and obligation, because it is enjoined on all employers, even those who have slaves in their employ, to give everybody this day off. Everyone has the right to it. There's nothing like this in any other ancient legislation. If you look at the other law codes, as I point out in the course of the Gifts of the Jews, they're all in favor of those on top. Those on the bottom don't seem to come up very often, except, at what point you can cut out their tongues or cut off their ears or something like that. That's the only point at which they seem to enter the ancient law codes. And here you have everyone included. Everyone is to be able to reflect, pray, and study. Everyone, therefore, is a human being. It's a very interesting beginning. Yes, sir?
Recently, in our own society, there's been a lot of talk, actually, among some of those people who are considered to be the most forward-looking about looking to renewability of energy sources, of environmental factors. Would you say, in light of what you've said before, that these are the progressive forces, or really just the people who want to return to the wheel?
That's a very good question. I would say, first of all, that we are all cyclical. We cannot help but be cyclical. We get up in the morning, we go to bed at night. Our bodies are cyclical. Any religion that has a liturgy has of necessity a cyclical format. We are cyclical. The Jews create something beyond the cyclical, which we call, or is normally called, the processive, or sometimes the linear, but I think processive is a better word. Once you become processive, you can't go back. You can't go back to the idea that fate rules, which is part of the cyclical. A very interesting factoid that was put in front of me by a European woman who found this hilarious. She had received in the mail something called, it was an American product, it was a mail order catalog called the Buddhist Catalog. And what she thought was hilarious was that here you have this religion, the center of which is supposed to be nothingness, and you have these American Buddhists telling you that you can be a better Buddhist if you buy these products. And she said that this could only Americans could come up with something like this, So I would say maybe they were Jewish Buddhists, but in any case, there's a way in which we can't, even when we receive the cyclical, we change it. We have to solve the problems of ecology, the fact that the earth is limited, the earth is not endless, but I think we must solve those things, but we must solve them in a processive manner. We have to find a way of doing that processively. And I think probably the answer to all of that is a gradual spiritualization that acknowledges that polluting the atmosphere in order to make more money is not the only way to go. And that doesn't mean that we return to the cyclical and we just become, you know, little peasants obeying the seasons. But it's not easy to say how this will work out, because it's never easy to talk about the future, since, as I said earlier, the only reality the future has is that it hasn't happened yet. Yes?
We were studying Torah this morning and talking about Sodom and Gomorrah, and Abraham arguing with God, questioning God about how would he destroy it if there were 50, 40, 30, and so forth righteous Jews, righteous people. And we got into a discussion of the propensity of the Jewish people to argue with God, and that we don't do that enough perhaps today. I read your book. I don't recall whether you addressed that.
Well, I don't address the question of whether we argue enough with God, but I do address the question I do point out that Abraham disagrees, and that Moses also, I mean, that the great figures get into arguments with God. And again, I think that is part of a sense of familiarity. I mean, God is beyond all knowing and beyond all telling, and he's pretty scary, and at the same time, these major figures in the Bible do argue with him. And I think it's it's almost a proof of their reliability and their authenticity that they do so. I would just tell you that within the Christian tradition there is this wonderful story of Teresa of Avila, who was a mystic and who did talk directly to God, and God talked back. And in one period of her life, she couldn't get on the phone with him any longer. He just didn't seem to pick up, you know, at the other end. She didn't know where he was, and finally he returned at some point. And she said, I was in this was the worst time of my life, where were you? And he said, and his response was, this is how I treat my friends. And she said, no wonder you have so few of them. So it's a very similar kind of response, I think. Yeah. Yes, sir.
It seems to me that what you're describing is summed up in the two Hebrew words tikkun olam, the perfection of the world, the concept that in fact it can be continually improved, and that this really is the concept that was accepted by the Western world.
Yeah. Yes and no. I think that there are, and I think I'll make this the last question because I see there are immense piles of books back there, and when you come by, you can, if you have another question, you can always put it to me, and between signatures I'll try to answer. But with regard to Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world, I would say that there are three great clusters of values that we're talking about here. One is the cluster of individuality. The second one is the cluster of time. And those two very much go together, because you can't have an individual unless he is in time going somewhere towards something. So you've got to have individuality and time. They almost go together. The third cluster, I would say, is what I think of as the justice cluster, or using the Hebrew word tzedakah. Now, it's in that you find the Tikkun Olam, which tends to be more part of the early rabbinical and middle rabbinical tradition it's not the word that the prophets used first, so I didn't use it. But that doesn't mean that I don't understand what you've just said. I do, and I think that it belongs to this third cluster that is intimately related with individuality and time, but we have yet to see that. We have yet to realize that. We're great at individuality and time. I mean, we just, you know, we here, Americans at the end of the 20th century, we have those two things down pat. But tzedakah, or justice, I mean, which is often translated as uprightness, because it really means that that if something has fallen down, you have an obligation to put it back where it belongs, so that if you have more food to eat than you need, you need to share it with those who don't have enough food, and if you have more clothes in your closet than you can wear, you have an obligation to give them away. And if you have more rooms in your house than you can fill with people, you have an obligation to open your house to others. That's a very radical idea, but that is the idea of the prophets when they say the word justice or tzedakah, and it's certainly what they are thinking of, what the rabbis were thinking of when they said tikkun olam. I think that we must, in coming years, find a way to make that little bud bloom into the same kind of enormous tree that individuality and time have blossomed into for us. The idea, if we want a real future, we have to find a way of making justice bloom. Thank you very much.